large crowd and turnout. Tonight, hopefully, we started off with the right thing, which is food in the back. So if you haven't seen that and haven't taken part, please do. It is for you. And I would love to start off with just a little bit of credit to Akash and ASU for co-sponsoring all that wonderful food. So if we can get ASU for our student over yes, it was super wonderful that ASU stepped up tonight and helped us co-sponsor this wonderful presentation that we hope to provide as really one of our culminating events in celebration of CU Diversity Week. It is my pleasure. My name is Scott Ferguson. I'm the director for the Office of Multicultural Services here at Concordia, and it's really wonderful to be a part of such a great week. We were just talking about how these weeks can be fast and furious, and there's just been great moments all the way through it. Tonight, we're going to take some time to slow down a little bit and have some great dialogue. It's a great conversation from an individual I think we're all really going to benefit from. So if you would, with a show of thumbs, how are we doing tonight? Let me see it. Oh, look at the thumbs up. We are doing good. I like that. So thank you for being participatory. I expect to see that the entire time tonight, which is wonderful. So tonight, in our conversation with JoAnn Hardesty, who is here to speak with us about some of the amazing work and accomplishments that she has lived through, her experiences, and be able to dialogue a little bit about some of what really inspired some of our student leaders at a past conference. We invited 4 of our student leaders, including one of our staff members, being something to go and actually hear JoAnn at the 2013 Students of Color Conference at the University of Oregon. And through that experience, all 4 unanimously recommended that we contact JoAnn in honor of our week because of the context and the passion that you spoke about the issues that we're talking about tonight. I wanted to take just a few moments to read a little bit of context that I found would be helpful in giving you some introduction to our speaker. So if I read it, that's what I'm looking at. All right. So one something I wanted to read tonight was that, so JoAnn, our speaker, really has, over time, shown a long-term commitment to social, racial, and economic justice. It has taken many years of organized advocacy with Portland City Council to adopt a plan in which racial profiling, even to the police bureau. The reason I wanted to read that specific sentence is because tonight, when we talk about how diversity has really impacted locally, what does it look like in our own backyard? How do we talk about not just difficult issues of race or social justice, but really talking about how do we see it every day? And thinking about that, even that sentence in the context of how do we perceive our role as citizens. What is our opportunity to have a voice, to engage in those conversations, to be a part of what is happening in our important area? As college students, we all the time, as faculty and staff, encourage you to think about what is your role in society? How do you have a voice, and when you have the opportunity, how do you use it? And tonight, I'm really hoping that JoAnn can engage us in some great conversation around the opportunity, what that looks like in North and Northeast Portland metro area, in Oregon, West Coast, and internationally. So without further ado, please welcome JoAnn Hardesty.
Oh. And there the papers went. It is such a pleasure to be here this evening. I want to thank Scott. I want to thank those 4 students that saw me in Eugene and thought I should come and speak with you during your Diversity Week. I'm going to tell you a series of stories because for me, it's really about telling a story to create the picture. But before I do that, I want to know how many people have read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, Colorblindness. Is that right? Mass incarceration in a time of colorblindness. This is, so there's a couple of you that have read it. This book, a couple of summers ago, somebody invited me to join a book club. And, you know, I had a couple of extra hours, so I thought, okay, that might be fun. And because the book is only 5 chapters, it went over 5 weeks. And so, thankfully, it was over a 5-week period of time. Because if you read this book, you have to sit with the information. It's not a book that you just kind of rush through and then go, okay, what's next? So when I read Michelle Alexander's book, we met actually in Northeast Portland at a little coffee shop, used to be there, called Reflections. which no longer exists. That's another story. But we met, and the book group kept going and going and going. And by the time it was done, we had about 32 people that were meeting every Saturday morning. And every time we discussed a chapter, our question was, what else can we do? We got to do something with this info. And so the first thing we did was organize a couple of community forums. We invited the community to come out, and we shared with them some of the information that we learned. Society would like us to believe, now that we have our first black president, everything's fine. All of a sudden, racism is no longer an issue, and we can all be president of the United States. But what Michelle Alexander tells us is that since the Jim Crow days, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples of the Jim Crow days, because when I was a kid on the evening news, I would see people that looked like me being brutalized because they wanted to eat at a lunch counter, or they wanted to go and be educated at a particular college, or they wanted to get a hotel because they were traveling. And I remembered as a kid saying to my parents over and over again, why? That doesn't seem fair. Why is that going on? And so, as a kid, I realized this was just unjust. This is just not fair, not right. So when I say Jim Crow, what do I mean? What I mean is that laws that were created to support segregation of African Americans in our community. And so let me give you a couple of examples. Some of them I found fascinating. So some of them I did find a bit interesting. So between 1880s into the 1960s, a majority of American states had some kind of laws around segregation. All the way from Delaware to California, North Dakota to Texas. And these are the kind of laws that were on the book. So if you are a nurse, no person or corporation shall require any white female nurse to nurse in wards or rooms in hospitals, either public or private, where Negro men work. Of course, you may know about the toilet facilities, right? You had to have separate toilet facilities for Negroes and whites. We all remember, oh, I love this one. Cohabitation. Any Negro man and white woman, or any white man and Negro woman, who are not married to each other, which was against the law, but are living together, occupying the same place at nighttime, should be punished by imprisonment not exceeding 12 months and a fine not exceeding $500. Now in 1960, you were talking some real money when you said $500. Those are the kind of laws that were put on the book, and they were very specific. The laws were on the books to ensure that after emancipation, that African Americans did not become full-fledged citizens in the community. That was really why the laws were put on the book. But of course, we had a civil rights movement, right? We had a civil rights movement, the Voting Rights Act was passed, all of a sudden accommodation laws were passed, and as Michelle Alexander says, and after that, we thought everything was fine. The laws had passed, so okay, we're good to go now. But what happened? Well, what happened was somebody came up with a bright idea, and it was Reagan, and he was running for office, and he was running to be president, and he would stand up and he would say, if you elect me president, I will conduct a war on drugs. Now what's ironic is that when he was running for president, drugs was not a big issue in any community across the country. But what that was a code so that what he was saying to poor Southern whites is it's okay, we got a plan. We got a plan because now that the civil rights movement has opened these doors, we've got a plan to divert a whole lot of African Americans to a place that we're going to build just for them. And that was the beginning of our mass incarceration of people of color. Now, what might surprise you is the sheer numbers of African American men who are in jail for marijuana-related charges across the country. In fact, Michelle Alexander talks about some communities in the East that have 70 to 80% of the African American male population under the control of the Department of Corrections. So they either are in jail, they're on parole, they're on probation. And you ask yourself, how is that even possible? How can 70% of a community go to jail? That seems insane. Well, the best thing that happened to Reagan was when crack cocaine hit the scene. Crack cocaine, now cocaine had been around for a long time, but crack cocaine was specifically in urban communities. And so crack cocaine became the image whereby Reagan was able to sell this get tough on crime, let's fight this drug war. He was able to do that because they could paint a picture of a crack addict. And I remember the pictures that they would show of the crack babies. And this was supposed to help the community understand, see, these babies are being born, and of course these are welfare moms. We could talk about welfare at a later date. But these were supposed to be welfare moms who are having these crack babies, and therefore the requirement was they went to jail for a much longer period of time than people in the suburbs who were snorting powder cocaine. And so that started the process. Of course, here in Oregon, we didn't like 3 strikes you're out. Most states decided that they would develop 3 strike you're out laws. So in Oregon, we had to go do one better. We decided we would develop a 1 strike you're out law, which is known as ballot measure 11 here. And so there's 26 crimes on that list, that if you commit one of those crimes, you do every single day in jail. Every single day. With the minimum sentence 5 years, 10 months. And when I first decided to become a legislator, that was what propelled me. I was like, this is not fair. This is going to have a negative impact, especially on young kids of color, no question. But the campaign ads wouldn't have told you that, because the campaign ads were all about getting tough on career criminals. And so, I don't know how many of you voted in that election, but I know I didn't vote for ballot measure 11, but many of my friends did. And then a couple of years later, they started seeing who was being sentenced under ballot measure 11. And it wasn't career criminals. It was 15, 16, and 17-year-olds, because all of a sudden, in Oregon, if you're 15 years old, you're not old enough to vote, you're not old enough to drive, but you are old enough to be tried as an adult and sentenced to an adult prison sentence. And so we did that. We did that as voters because when we voted for it, we believed the hype from Kevin Mannix, who I unfortunately served with when I was in Salem. And so, the idea of the new Jim Crow is what is happening today that reinforces this issue of African American male especially bad, and whatever they do, it's wrong. What reinforces that? For me, it's the police on the street. And in the city that I live in Portland, I've had a long career in trying to bring accountability into policing practices. Let me give an example. And so, you may know that there have been too many, but many people in the city of Portland who have lost their lives at the hands of the police when they were unarmed, several times when they were called to do a welfare check. And what we found in these cases, in every case, in fact, there's only been one officer in the history of Portland Police Bureau who's ever been disciplined for using force against a community member. And he was only disciplined because he put the wrong bullet in his gun. And he ended up shooting someone with live rounds, and he thought he was using a beanbag gun. but that was the only guy in the history of the City of Portland Police Bureau who's ever been charged. So I work with an organization, a grassroots group called the Albina Ministerial Alliance Coalition for Justice and Police Reform. And in 2010, 3 big cases of people being killed by Portland police were in the press. One was a gentleman named Keaton Otis. And on May 10th, 2010, Keaton Otis was a 24-year-old African-American man driving his mother's car down by Lloyd Center. A gang enforcement team drove up next to him at a stoplight, looked over at him, and he had a hoodie on that was up over his head. They said he was slouching in the car, and he wouldn't make eye contact with them. And so one of the police officers said to the other one, well, he looks like he could be a gang member. Let's go pull him over. And so they proceed to follow him. And as any sane person would do, when the police follow you, you don't drive as good as you do if you're not being followed by the police, right? And so he made some minor traffic violation, which was sufficient for them to pull him over. And he wouldn't stop. And in fact, because he yelled out the window to an elderly African-American woman, please don't leave me, because they're going to kill me. They marched his car in, and within 53 seconds of him being stopped, they shot him 26 times. But let me tell you the police version of the story. You'll get a kick out of this. And so what the police say happened is that when they pulled him over, he was cursing at them, wouldn't get out of the car. They said that he then, while they were tasing him, so you have to know that 3 police officers were simultaneously tasing Keaton Otis at the time that he reached into his glove compartment, pulled a Crown Royal bag out, opened it up, pulled a gun out, shot an officer in the leg, and then sat on the gun. He did that in 53 seconds while being tased simultaneously. You'd have to believe that if you were a Portland police officer. I don't believe that version. The community believes that the gun was planted because it was just humanly impossible to do what they said happened. So that was Keaton Otis. Then there was James Chassie. James Chassie was a schizophrenic man who lived downtown, walking down the street, broad daylight. Portland police officers see him. Portland police allege that he had drugs. And so they confronted him. In fact, they didn't just confront him, they brutalized him. They stomped this man to death on the street downtown Portland in broad daylight in front of witnesses. So the first police report was he had drugs. Well, he did have a sandwich bag that did have some white substance in the bottom. The white substance was breadcrumbs, because he'd come from a food kitchen earlier that morning. Stomped him to death. So that was James Chassie. And last but not least, in 2010, was Aaron Campbell. Now, Aaron Campbell was a young man who had lost his brother earlier that day due to kidney failure. And so the police were sent to do a welfare check because his girlfriend's mother called and said, he's really upset because his brother died earlier today. We need you to go and check on him. There was an allegation that he had a gun in the house. And so the police came with the SWAT team, and they had a negotiator. The negotiator's talking to him, and after a while, he lets the kids out of the house, his girlfriend comes out of the house, and he's walking out of the house following the directions of the negotiator. The negotiator tells him to walk out backwards with his hands up. The moment he gets outside, somebody hits him with a beanbag. And what happens when you get hit with a beanbag? You go like this. Half a football field away was a sharpshooter named Fresh Out. He saw that and went, oh, he's reaching for a gun. Shot and killed him. So that's just 2010. And so After that, after Erin Campbell, we said, okay, enough is enough. As a community, we have gone to City Hall to seek redress, to seek changes in the policy on oversight of police. Yet, these things just keep happening. And yet, the police officers are all exonerated. They didn't do anything wrong. They acted within training. And so we asked the question, how is it possible that unarmed community members continue to die, yet nobody did anything wrong? So we had this brainstorm. We thought, okay, we will go get the big boys to come to town. So we invited the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division to come to Portland and to do an investigation of Portland police into the patterns and practices of the behavior of Portland police officers as they related to African American men. So the DOJ came to town. They said, okay, we're coming. And I was like, yes, justice, finally, right? Because when I was a kid, when the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division came to town, they were going to kick butt. They were going to make sure that whoever was violating people's civil rights, they were going to be held accountable. That's what I grew up with watching on TV, right? Because I'm a kid of the 60s. So they came to town, they did an investigation. The investigation lasted 14 months. And sometime between the time they came to town and the time they concluded the investigation, they did a bait and switch on us. All of a sudden, they were no longer investigating what was happening with African American men in our community. They came in and investigated what was happening with people with mental health issues or people perceived to have mental health issues. Now, we were all a little shocked because, you know, we were clear about why we wanted them to come to town. And we know there are certainly issues with people with mental health issues, but we were like, why is that? And depending upon who we asked in the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, depends on what kind of answer we got. So when Thomas Perez was here, and we asked him that question, he said, well, you may know that the U.S. Supreme Court nowadays does not allow claims of racial bias unless you can prove intent. Now, you may remember that New York Police Department was on trial in federal court for the exact same kind of behavior. And the only reason they were able to go to federal court was because they had some brave police officers who recorded what was taking place in roll call. So in New York City, in 1 year, they stopped 427,000 African Americans, which was males, African American males between the age of 13 and 24 in New York. And at that time, ironically, that was double the number of African American males that lived in the city of New York, which means that some African American males were stopped a whole lot in 1 year. So that was New York. So anyway, that was the first answer, was that you can't take it to the federal court if you can't prove intent. So we didn't like that answer. And we said, well, but that's what you told us you were going to investigate. The second answer that they gave us was because they could only go back 14 months to review the police records, the records for 14 months did not make the case for racially biased policing in the city of Portland, even though we have the results that we have. So the findings came in, and we were ecstatic as a community, because if you read the findings, you would be appalled at some of the behavior of some of Portland police officers when they go out to check on people, to find out how they're doing. A couple of the cases they told me, a couple of the cases I read in the findings, one case, a woman calls because there's a gentleman that's in distress. She can hear him in distress in his apartment. And so she calls the police to come and do a welfare check. And the police come, and of course the police, when they come, they say, sit down. They knock on the guy's door, the guy opens the door, the guy's buck naked. They say to the guy, sit down. And the guy is talking kind of in a gibberish tone, and the guy wouldn't sit down. So then they punch the guy in the face about 3 or 4 times until he's on the ground. Then they tase him. And so after they tase him, what they find out is the guy was actually in a diabetic. He was suffering from diabetic coma. So he was like close to falling into a coma. That was one case. There are many, many other cases like that in the findings. And so we think again, we read the findings and we're like, yeah, we're finally going to get some justice. And then, what was it? 2 weeks later, they go behind closed doors and they create a settlement agreement. And the settlement agreement is a negotiated settlement between the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division and the City of Portland and the Portland Police Association, which is their union. Now, I have to tell you, the settlement agreement has absolutely nothing to do with the findings when they came out to investigate the behavior. So, what does the settlement agreement do? It requires us to build a behavioral health unit within Portland Police Bureau, right? So the people who are brutalizing people when they go to do welfare checks now will have a new title. They get to come from the behavioral health unit and go and supposedly get trained additionally. The citizens in the city of Portland are going to spend $26 million over the next 5 years on this settlement agreement. It's going to come out of the general fund, and it's going to pay for more police, for more police training, and for what the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division lovingly called our self-defeating accountability system. We have in place for the police, which is why we had to go to the DOJ, we have in place for the police in the city of Portland a system that works like this. If you're a community member who feels you've been harmed, and you go into the City Hall building, to the IPR, Independent Police Review office, you file a complaint. Somebody in that office then decides whether or not your complaint is worthy of being investigated. Last year, that office threw out 77% of the complaints that came in their door. 77%. Guess where the complaints go that they investigate? Anybody want to take a stab? I heard it.
Police Bureau.
To the police bureau, exactly. So the ones that they finally decide that they're going to investigate, the police are the ones that conduct the investigation. And what we know to be true is that the police don't tend to find the police have done anything wrong when they investigate themselves. And so the settlement agreement, as investigators to the Independent Police Review Office, except it doesn't actually require them to do investigations. So you can say, well, what are we getting for $26 million? Not much. And guess what? Because this is supposedly about people with mental health issues or people perceived to have mental health issues, anybody want to take a crack at how much of that $26 million will go to help support people in mental health distress? Go ahead, a number. I heard it over here, zero, zip, nada, right? The settlement agreement calls for drop-off centers, but it actually doesn't require the city of Portland to provide it. And in fact, when we went in front of the federal judge a few weeks ago on February 18th, we said, but there's nothing in this settlement agreement that's making them create the mental health system. So basically, the federal government wants us to spend $26 million to retrain Portland police, to give them more investigators, but yet not put one penny into beds for people who have mental health issues, who need the beds, right? We're going to spend $26 million on the police. And so we had fun a few weeks ago. We went to the federal fairness hearing. As a community activist, one of my jobs was to make sure the community knew that there was going to be an opportunity for the community to weigh in on this settlement agreement. And maybe you've been reading in the Oregonian over the last couple of days that the city of Portland says this settlement agreement is just fine. We don't know why all those people came and testified and said it was bad. My organization, the AMA, called